years after her death, Ayn Rand's philosophy of selfishness and billionaire empowerment rules the world. And today, the United States and other independent governments around the world are crumbling while Ayn Rand's billionaires are taking over. With each new so-called free trade agreement, especially the very secretive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has less to do with trade and more to do with a new law of global governance for transnational corporations. With each one of these, Ayn Rand's reviled state, or what we would call our democracy, the United States of America, is losing its power to billionaires and transnational corporations. Ayn Rand hated governments and democracy. She considered them systems of what she called mob rule. She grew up in Russia. As a child, she watched the Bolsheviks confiscate her father's pharmacy during the Russian Revolution. Likely suffering from PTSD from that incident, Ayn Rand devoted her future writings to evil government, including the evil of government functions like taxation, regulation, and providing social services to the poor or the sick. In her mind, and in her writings, she divided the world into makers and takers, or what she called looters. On one side are the billionaires and the industrialists, people like Dagny Taggart, a railroad tycoon, and Hank Rearden, a steel magnate. Both were fictional characters in her book Atlas Shrugged, but both have real-world counterparts in the form of the Koch brothers, the Waltons, and Sheldon Adelson. According to Rand, they're the Atlases holding up the world. So in Atlas Shrugged, when the billionaires, tired of paying taxes and complying with government regulation, when those billionaires went on strike, Ayn Rand wrote that the American economy promptly collapsed. On the other side are the people that she calls the looters, or everyone who isn't as rich or privileged, or who believes in a democratic government, small d, to provide basic services, empower labor unions, regulate the economy. According to Ayn Rand, they're the leeches of society, and according to Mitt Romney with his 47% comments. And as she told Mike Wallace in 1959, they do not even deserve love. To our founding fathers, looking out for the general welfare of the population was an explicit role of the government, one of its most important, and one of the reasons why our nation was created when we separated from Britain. But to Ayn Rand, a government that taxed billionaires to help pay for health care and education for impoverished children, it was not just unwise economically. In her world, it was also immoral. You know, nature abhors a vacuum, both in the wild and in politics. So when people, organized in the form of a government, are removed from power, then money, organized in the form of corporations and billionaires, moves into the vacuum to take that power, which is exactly what's happening today all across the world. In 30 years after her death, the United States crept closer and closer to Ayn Rand's utopia. Reagan dramatically slashed taxes on the rich and went after labor unions. Clinton deregulated financial markets for the rich, ending welfare as we know it, and committed our nation to one globalist corporate free trade agreement after another. And under Bush and Obama, we've seen the rapid privatization of our commons, the further erosion of social safety nets, and more losses of national sovereignty with more so-called free trade agreements. In Europe, we're seeing sovereign governments neutered by conservative technocrats. According to Ayn Rand, the rich should never be asked to sacrifice. So instead, it's working people across the Eurozone who have to pay for the bad investments that the banksters made in the run-up to the global financial collapse. As we saw in Greece in 2011, with the deposing of Prime Minister George Papandreou, and all across the state of Michigan over the last few years with financial managers' laws. When small d democratic governments are unwilling to do the bidding of the rich, they're immediately replaced by corporate lackeys who will. The Taggarts and the Reardens are holding the reins of government today, which explains why corporate America paid an average tax rate of just 12% in 2011, the lowest rate in over 40 years. It explains why 400 billionaires in America now own more wealth than 150 million other Americans combined. and it explains why fewer impoverished Americans are getting less federal assistance than at any time in the last half-century. Ayn Rand envisioned a world without governments, a world where the super rich are free to do as they wish. You know, we tried that during the so-called Gilded Age of the late 19th century, before Ayn Rand was alive. If she'd watched the ruthlessness of the robber barons like she did the Bolsheviks, she might have reached different conclusions. She may have realized that American presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower were right when they made sure that wealth was more evenly distributed and the billionaire class was held in check. Or she may have come to understand that corporations and billionaires owe their wealth to the state and not the other way around. Without favorable patent and copyright laws, a court system, an educated workforce, and an infrastructure to move goods around the country, and no one would be able to get rich in America. We'd be like the libertarian paradise of Somalia. As Harry Moser, the founder of the Reshoring Initiative, argued in The Economist, corporations are not created by the shareholders or the management. Rather, they're created by the state. They're granted important privileges by the state, limited liability, eternal life, etc. They're granted these privileges because the state expects them to do something beneficial for the society that makes the grant. They may well provide benefits to other societies, but their main purpose is to provide benefits to the societies, not the shareholders, not to management, but to the societies that create them. Sadly, this understanding of how democratic republics work and why has been lost this generation. And Ayn Rand's disciples are making sure the next generation never finds about it again. Idaho State Senator John Getty, who chairs that state's education committee, introduced a bill this week that would require all students to read Ayn Rand's book Atlas Shrugged before they can graduate. Getty explained that the book made his son a Republican and that it certainly gives one a sense of personal responsibility. Between stupidity like this and the rebirth of Ayn Rand through corporate-funded think tanks and Hollywood movies, the billionaire class wants to make sure that the next generation buys into a toxic ideology that's quite literally destroying the world as we know it. They don't want the 21st century to be America's century. They want it to be the billionaire century. And if they succeed, then the middle class in America and throughout most of the developed world is going to go extinct. And that's the way it is tonight, Thursday, February 7th, 2013.